A lonely rancher finds an Apache slave in the desert and never imagines she will stay with him. John Mercer lived alone on the edge of the Arizona desert. His ranch was small but well kept, a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by dry earth and cacti. He had inherited it from his father, who had passed away many years ago, leaving John to manage it by himself. The days were long and quiet. John had no neighbors close by, and the nearest town was miles away. The wind would howl across the desert at night, rattling the shutters and whispering through the dry grass. He often sat on the porch of his small cabin, staring at the horizon as the sun painted the sky with gold and pink. Loneliness had become a familiar companion, a silent shadow that followed him everywhere. John had been married once. His wife, Margaret, had died suddenly from an illness that no doctor could cure. The grief had hollowed him out at first, leaving him numb and unsure how to continue. Over time, he learned to live with the silence and the emptiness, filling his days with work on the ranch. He tended to his cattle, repaired fences, and ensured that his land remained fertile. Even though the work kept him busy, there was a part of him that ached for companionship, someone to share his thoughts, his worries, and his quiet moments of beauty with. One afternoon, the sun beat down mercilessly on the desert. John had ridden out to check a distant water hole where he sometimes let his cattle drink. The heat made the air shimmer, and the sand seemed to burn beneath his boots. He shaded his eyes with a hand and squinted across the rocks. Something unusual caught his attention, a faint movement, barely noticeable. He slowed his horse and approached cautiously, not sure what he might find. Among the rocks he saw a figure crouched low to the ground. At first he thought it might be an animal, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a person. A young woman, with dark hair tangled and dusty, was leaning against a rock, her clothes torn and her skin sunburned. She looked frightened, and when she saw him she tried to hide further, curling up as small as possible. John stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands visible. He did not want to scare her. "It's all right," he said gently. "I won't hurt you." The woman looked at him with wide, dark eyes filled with fear and mistrust. She did not speak. John could see the bruises on her arms and legs, and her body trembled from exhaustion and hunger. She was clearly in pain, and it was clear she had been running for a long time. John knew he could not leave her there. The desert was unforgiving, and she would not survive on her own. He dismounted from his horse and approached slowly, holding out a canteen of water. "Here," he said softly, "drink. You must be thirsty." At first she refused, shaking her head and shrinking back. John stayed calm, giving her time. He understood that she had been hurt before, and that trust would not come quickly. Finally, after a long pause, she took the canteen with trembling hands and drank greedily, spilling some over her chin. "Thank you," he said quietly. "My name is John Mercer. What's yours?" The woman did not answer. She only looked away, hugging her knees to her chest. John realized that words might not help her yet. She had been through something terrible, and it would take time before she could speak again. He gestured toward his horse. "I can take you to my ranch. There's food, water, and a place to rest. You don't have to be afraid there." She hesitated, then nodded slightly. John helped her onto the horse behind him, careful not to hurt her further. The ride back to his ranch was slow and quiet. The desert stretched endlessly around them, golden and harsh, but also beautiful. The wind cooled their faces, and the silence felt less heavy than before. When they arrived at the ranch, John led her to the cabin. He showed her a small bed in the corner and set a bowl of water and some bread on a table. She ate slowly, glancing around as if taking in every detail of the room. John watched her carefully, making sure she felt safe. Over the next few days, John tried to help her recover. He gave her clean clothes, bandaged her bruises, and prepared simple meals. She still did not speak much, but she began to trust him in small ways, sitting closer, accepting food without fear, and eventually resting without flinching at every sound. John learned to be patient. He understood that healing was not just about food and water. It was also about kindness, safety, and respect. He spoke to her gently, telling her stories about the ranch, the cattle, and the desert. He described the sunsets and the animals, painting a picture of a world that was not all pain and fear. Slowly, she began to respond, offering a nod, a small smile, or a quiet glance that showed she understood. The local townsfolk, however, were not as welcoming. When they learned that John had taken in a young Apache woman, they whispered behind his back. Some warned him that harboring a runaway could bring trouble, while others judged him harshly, unable to understand why he would care for someone so different from himself. John did not respond to their whispers. He knew that what mattered most was the woman's safety and well-being, not the opinions of others. Despite the challenges, life on the ranch began to change. John no longer felt the same emptiness he had before. The woman's presence brought a new energy, a sense of purpose. He gave her a name, Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her language, even though she had not yet told him her real name. The name felt right, as if it could help her start anew. Days turned into weeks, and Ayana slowly became a part of the ranch. She learned to help with small chores, feeding the chickens, gathering water, and even tending to a small garden John had planted. Though she was quiet, her movements were graceful and careful, and John admired her strength and determination. In her silence, there was a sense of dignity that commanded respect. John found himself talking to her more often, telling her about his life, his losses, and the dreams he had once held. He shared memories of his wife, the laughter they had shared, and the quiet nights on the porch watching the stars. Ayana listened, sometimes offering a soft nod or a gentle look, as if acknowledging his words without speaking. The desert, once lonely and harsh, began to feel alive. The sunset seemed brighter, the nights less cold, and even the long, tiring days had a purpose. John realized that he had not only rescued Ayana, but had also found a connection he thought he would never have again. Though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Both John and Ayana were beginning a journey together, a journey of trust, healing, and unexpected companionship. The desert, once a place of isolation, had become the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one neither of them could have imagined. And so, under the endless sky and the blazing sun of the Arizona desert, a lonely rancher and a wounded young woman began to find each other, slowly, quietly, and with the hope that tomorrow might bring a brighter, safer world. Life on the ranch slowly settled into a routine, but it was far from easy. The desert had a way of testing those who lived on its edges. John Mercer worked harder than ever, not just for himself, but to provide safety and stability for Ayana. The young woman, though quiet, was beginning to take small steps toward healing. She still flinched at sudden noises and avoided strangers, but she was learning to trust John in ways she had not allowed anyone before. John noticed the little things first, how she would linger by the door when he came back from the fields, watching him with cautious curiosity, how she would hum quietly to herself while tending the garden, a soft melody that seemed to bring life to the dry, cracked soil, how she would gently brush a stray hair from her face, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and resilience. Each of these small gestures gave John hope. He knew that trust was fragile, and he did not want to rush her. Despite the quiet peace of the ranch, the outside world was not so forgiving. News traveled slowly in the desert, but it always reached those who cared, or those who judged. The townsfolk had learned that John had taken in a young Apache woman, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Some were curious, some critical, and some openly hostile. One afternoon, as John rode into town to collect supplies, a few men approached him. Their faces were stern, and their eyes flicked toward Ayana, who was helping carry baskets at the edge of the town market. "John Mercer," one of them said, his voice sharp, "we hear you've been keeping a runaway around here." "That's dangerous business." John stopped his horse and faced him calmly. "I am keeping her safe, that's all. She is not causing trouble, and she has a right to live free from harm." The men snorted, exchanging glances. "You think the law won't catch up with her? You think trouble won't find its way to your ranch?" John held their gaze, steady and unflinching. "I take responsibility for my actions. I am not afraid of doing what is right." The men grumbled, clearly unsatisfied, and walked away, muttering under their breaths. John sighed and shook his head, feeling the weight of the tension. The desert might be quiet, but the world beyond it was not always kind. He knew that keeping Ayanna safe would require more than food and shelter. It would require courage, patience, and a careful understanding of the dangers that lurked nearby. Back at the ranch, John and Ayanna continued their routine. She was learning small chores, carrying water from the well and helping with the animals. Slowly, they began to communicate, not just with words, but with gestures and glances. John would point to the chickens and show her how to feed them. She would nod, mimicking his movements until she did it correctly. He taught her how to milk a cow, gather eggs, and even mend broken fences. In turn, Ayanna showed a quiet intelligence, observing and learning quickly, adapting to the demands of ranch life with surprising skill. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, John noticed her sitting by the porch, staring out at the desert. Her eyes were distant, filled with thoughts he could not understand. He walked over and sat beside her, careful to give her space. "You've been quiet today," he said gently. "Is something on your mind?" Ayanna looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she pointed toward the horizon. John followed her gaze and saw the colors of the sunset reflected in the desert sand. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. John smiled. "Yes, it is. I used to watch it with my wife. We would sit here for hours just looking at the sky." She turned her head, glancing at him. He saw a flicker of curiosity, a hint of connection. In that moment he realized that words were not always necessary. Sometimes understanding could be found in shared silence, in watching the world together, and in simply being present for one another. But peace is often fragile in the desert. One night while John was checking on the cattle, he noticed tracks in the sand near the edge of the property. They were fresh, and they led toward the cabin. His heart tightened. The tracks were too deliberate to be random. They belonged to someone searching for Ayanna. He hurried back, finding her sitting quietly inside, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up at him, fear flashing in her eyes. "They are close," she said softly, her voice trembling. "They will find me if we are not careful." John's mind raced. He had known this day might come. He had hoped it would not, but he was not naive. He needed a plan, a way to protect her. He moved quietly, closing shutters and securing doors. He retrieved his rifle from the corner, making sure it was ready if needed. Over the next few days, John and Ayanna took extra precautions. They avoided leaving the ranch unless absolutely necessary. John spent hours watching the horizon, scanning for movement, while Ayanna helped tend the animals inside the safety of the fenced area. The tension was constant, a shadow over every action and thought. Despite the fear, their bond continued to grow. John admired her courage. Though she was terrified, she did not break. She faced the danger with a quiet strength that amazed him. And she began to show more of herself in small ways, sharing her thoughts in gestures, sketches in the dirt, or by pointing at objects and smiling. Slowly, trust was blossoming, even under the pressure of fear. One day, a group of travelers passed by the ranch. They were merchants, heading to the next town with their wagons. John greeted them politely, but he noticed Ayanna tensing, her eyes narrowing at the approaching strangers. He understood her instinct immediately. She had learned to read danger and had survived through constant vigilance. The travelers asked for water and directions, and John provided both. But he noticed Ayanna stepping back, hiding slightly behind the cabin. He did not scold her. Instead, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder and gave her a reassuring smile. She looked at him and allowed herself a tiny nod, a sign that she trusted him to protect her. That evening, John reflected on the changes in their lives. The desert was still harsh, and dangers remained, but he no longer felt the same emptiness he had felt for years. Ayanna had brought a sense of life and purpose to the ranch. He realized that he was not just protecting her. He was learning to care for another human being in a way he had thought impossible after losing Margaret. Ayanna, too, was changing it. She was slowly opening her heart to the idea that not all people were cruel or selfish. John's kindness, patience, and determination showed her that safety and compassion could exist even in a world that had often been cruel. She began to dream quietly of a future where she could live without fear, where she could laugh, learn, and be free. Yet the desert remained unpredictable. Nights were long and filled with howling winds. Wild animals sometimes wandered too close, and the threat of slave hunters or bandits always lingered on the horizon. Every day required vigilance, courage, and careful planning. And though John and Ayanna faced these dangers together, they also discovered strength in one another. They began to communicate more naturally. Words were still few, but gestures, shared glances, and small acts of care spoke volumes. Ayanna learned to trust John's presence, knowing that he would not abandon her even when the world beyond the ranch seemed threatening. And John learned to read her moods, understand her fears, and anticipate her needs without being told. Their days were filled with work, but also moments of quiet connection. They would watch the sunset together, listen to the wind whispering through the desert, and marvel at the stars that seemed brighter here than anywhere else. The ranch was no longer just a place of labor. It had become a sanctuary, a fragile but growing home for two people who had been scarred by the world yet were learning to trust and care for one another. And though danger lingered always at the edges of the desert, John and Ayanna were no longer alone. Together, they faced the challenges, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The harsh, unforgiving landscape that had once symbolized isolation was slowly becoming a place of hope, resilience, and unexpected companionship. The weeks following the travelers' visit were tense but quiet. John and Ayanna had settled into their routine, their trust growing steadily, but the shadows of the outside world still lingered. John knew that eventually someone would discover Ayanna's presence, and he feared what might happen if they did. He had hoped to delay the confrontation, but the desert had a way of bringing the past into the present, no matter how carefully one tried to avoid it. One late afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the air shimmered with heat, John noticed movement at the edge of the property. At first he thought it might be an animal, perhaps a coyote or a stray horse, but then he saw the unmistakable shape of human figures. 3 men were approaching cautiously, moving through the desert grass with purpose. They were strangers, their faces partially hidden by scarves and wide-trimmed hats, but John could see the determination in their posture. He turned to Ayanna, who had been gathering firewood nearby. Her body stiffened immediately and she froze, eyes wide with fear. John stepped toward her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Stay inside," he instructed calmly. "Don't make a sound." Ayanna nodded, moving quickly but quietly back toward the cabin. She ducked inside and peeked through the window, her dark eyes fixed on the approaching men. John mounted his horse and rode toward them, keeping his rifle ready but lowering it slightly so as not to provoke an immediate confrontation. The men stopped a few yards from him. One of them stepped forward, removing his scarf. He had a sharp, cold expression and carried a whip at his side. "John Mercer," he called, his voice carrying over the dry desert wind. "We're looking for a young woman. You've been hiding her here. Hand her over, and we'll let you go without trouble." John's jaw tightened. He had hoped he would never hear these words, but now they were here, demanding what he could not give.
"She is under my protection," he replied steadily. "You will not take her," the man sneered.
"Do you think you can stop us? You're alone out here, Mercer. No one will help you." John shook his head. "I don't need anyone else. I will protect her myself." The men exchanged a glance, then began to advance. John backed towards the cabin, keeping himself between the intruders and Ayanna. The wind whipped through the desert, carrying dust and the tension of the moment. Ayanna watched from the window, her heart pounding. She wanted to help, but she knew John was right. She needed to stay hidden to survive until he had a chance to drive them away. As the men got closer, John called out, "Leave now and no one gets hurt. This is your only warning." The leader laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "We're not leaving until we find her. You can try all you want, but you'll regret standing in our way." John's mind raced. He had never faced a situation like this before. The desert had always been harsh, but the dangers were usually animals, storms, or the unforgiving sun, not armed men demanding a young woman's capture. He realized that he had to act quickly and decisively. He retreated inside the cabin, motioning for Ayanna to follow him. She was trembling, but kept her composure. John handed her a small knife he carried for protection. "If they get too close, you need to defend yourself," he whispered. "But stay behind me as long as you can. We face this together." Ayanna nodded silently, gripping the knife tightly. She had learned to control her fear over the past weeks, and now she focused all her energy on the present, on surviving and on trusting John. The intruders tried the door, pushing and pulling with force, but John had reinforced it with wooden planks. He could hear their grunts of frustration as they tested every window and attempted to peer inside. He realized that brute strength alone would not protect them. They needed strategy. John glanced at Ayanna. "Follow my lead. Watch carefully and move when I tell you." He moved to the side of the cabin, waiting for the right moment. When the men were distracted, talking among themselves, John slipped out a back door, keeping low behind the stacks of firewood. He managed to circle around and confront them from an unexpected angle. The element of surprise gave him confidence. "Leave her alone!" he shouted, planting himself firmly in front of the leader. The man swung the whip, but John ducked and sidestepped, using the whip's momentum against the attacker. He managed to knock it aside and force the man backward. The other two intruders hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. Inside the cabin, Ayanna watched in awe. She had never seen anyone defend themselves with such courage. Something stirred inside her, a mix of fear, admiration, and a desire to help. She realized that she was no longer just a helpless victim. She was part of this fight, part of this bond that had grown between her and John. Suddenly, one of the intruders broke from the group and tried to sneak around the side of the cabin. Ayanna took a deep breath, then stepped out from behind the door. She brandished the knife, her hand steady despite her fear. "Stay back!" she shouted. The man froze, surprised by her sudden courage. He had not expected the quiet, timid-looking woman to confront him. In that moment, John glanced her way and saw the determination in her eyes. He felt a surge of pride and relief. She was strong, and she would not give up easily. The intruders retreated, realizing that their plan was failing. They had not expected resistance, and the combined courage of John and Ayanna was more than they anticipated. Muttering threats, they eventually withdrew into the desert, disappearing over the horizon. John exhaled, the tension leaving his body in a rush. He turned to Ayanna, who was still clutching the knife, her face pale but triumphant. He smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You were brave," he said softly. "I could not have done it without you." Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting a mix of fear, relief, and something else. Trust. She nodded quietly, still trembling but proud. For the first time, she realized that she was not alone, that she had someone who would fight beside her, and someone she could fight for in return. That night, after ensuring the cabin was secure, John and Ayanna sat together on the porch. The desert was calm, the stars glittering above them, and the events of the day seemed almost unreal in the quiet of the night. John offered her a cup of warm tea, and she accepted, her hands shaking slightly. "You did well today," he said, his voice calm but filled with admiration. Not everyone would have had the courage to stand up like that. Ayanna sipped her tea and looked out at the horizon. I did what I had to," she said softly. "I wanted to help." John nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He realized that the events of the day had changed something fundamental between them. The trust they had been building had been tested under fire, and it had not broken. It had strengthened. They were no longer just a man and a young woman sharing a quiet desert ranch. They were partners, allies, and friends bound by survival, courage, and care. The days that followed were quieter, but the tension never fully left. John knew that danger might return, that the outside world could still threaten their peace, but he also knew that they were stronger together. He and Ayanna worked side by side, tending the animals, repairing fences, and reinforcing the cabin. Every chore became a test of their growing partnership, a demonstration of their mutual trust and determination. Ayana began to speak more often, slowly at first, then more confidently. She shared small stories of her past, fragments of her life before she had been forced to flee. John listened patiently, offering comfort and understanding. In turn, he shared his memories of Margaret, of the life he had once known, and the dreams he still held in his heart. Through these exchanges, their bond deepened. Words were no longer the only connection. They understood each other through gestures, glances, and actions. They had faced danger together, and they had emerged stronger. The desert, once a symbol of isolation and fear, had become a place of resilience, courage, and unexpected friendship. By the time the first signs of spring appeared, small green shoots breaking through the dry soil, the soft chirping of birds returning to the desert, John and Ayana had settled into a rhythm. The events of the intruder's visit remained fresh in their minds, a reminder of the dangers they faced, but also of the strength they had discovered within themselves and each other. The turning point had come, and they had survived it. And in surviving, they had begun to understand the true meaning of trust, courage, and companionship. The desert no longer felt like a place of loneliness. It was now a place of connection, where two people who had once been lost had found each other, and where the promise of tomorrow held hope, safety, and the possibility of a shared future. After the incident with the intruders, life on the ranch changed in ways John had not anticipated. The sense of danger had left, but it lingered like a quiet shadow, reminding them that the outside world was not always kind. John had thought that after defending Ayana once, things might settle down, but the events only brought new challenges. The townsfolk who had already been suspicious of his actions began to watch him more closely. Whispers carried across the desert winds, reaching the ears of neighbors and travelers alike. But many criticized him for harboring someone they considered an outsider. Ayana noticed it first. As they ventured into town for supplies, people stared, some with curiosity, others with judgment. Children whispered to each other and pointed. Shopkeepers eyed her warily. Ayana, who had grown used to keeping a low profile, felt uncomfortable under their scrutiny. She hung back, clutching a basket of goods tightly, while John moved confidently beside her, offering quiet reassurance. "Don't let them bother you," John said softly, noticing her hesitation. "We are doing what is right. That is all that matters." Ayana nodded, but she could not hide the flicker of unease in her eyes. She had been running from danger her entire life, and though she had found safety on John's ranch, the world outside still reminded her of what she had endured. Yet she also felt a growing sense of courage. Ghislaine rest. She had faced intruders before, and she had survived with John by her side. This time, the scrutiny of townsfolk was different, but it did not feel as threatening. At the ranch, John and Ayana focused on rebuilding a sense of normalcy. They worked together to repair fences, care for the animals, and maintain the crops. Each task brought them closer, not only in physical effort but in mutual understanding. John began to notice small changes in Ayana, how she smiled at the chickens as she fed them, how she hummed while working in the garden, and how her confidence grew with every chore she mastered. Yet the outside pressures continued. One day, a neighbor, a man named Thomas, rode up to the ranch, his horse kicking up dust. Thomas was an influential figure in the town, respected by some and feared by others. He had heard the rumors about John harboring Ayana and wanted to confront him directly. "John," Thomas called as he dismounted. "We need to talk." John met him on the porch, his posture calm but firm. "About what?" he asked. Thomas's gaze shifted toward the cabin, where Ayana was quietly tending to the animals. "About her," he said bluntly. "Everyone is talking." "Some think you are doing something dangerous. Others think you are breaking the law. You need to explain yourself." John took a deep breath. He had expected this confrontation, and he had prepared himself for it. "She is safe here," he said steadily. "I am responsible for her. She has been through more than anyone should, and I will not turn her out into danger." Thomas shook his head, frustration clear on his face.
You know how people are, John.
They do not understand. They will not see the good you are doing. They will only see what is different. John met his gaze. Then let them see what they want. I am not doing this for their approval. I am doing this because it is right. Thomas sighed, realizing that he would not change John's mind. He left, muttering under his breath, but John knew that the scrutiny would continue. He understood that protecting Ayana meant more than just keeping her safe from strangers. It also meant standing firm against the judgment of the world. Inside the cabin, Ayana watched the exchange from the window. She felt a mix of fear and admiration. Fear, because the world beyond the ranch seemed harsh and unforgiving. Admiration, because John faced that world with courage and determination, refusing to back down. She realized that she was not just relying on him for protection. She was learning from him, gaining courage and confidence that she had not felt in years. Days turned into weeks, and the harsh desert sun gave way to cooler mornings and crisp evenings. John and Ayana continued their work on the ranch, but the challenges persisted. One morning they discovered that some of the fences had been tampered with. Tracks in the dirt suggested that someone had been near the cattle at night, perhaps testing the boundaries or trying to intimidate them. John knelt by the tracks, examining them carefully. Someone was here, he said quietly. They wanted to see if we were alone, if we were weak. Ayana moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. What will we do? She asked. John looked at her, seeing the concern in her eyes. We will be careful, he said. We will watch, we will protect, and we will not let fear control us. Together we are stronger than they think. Her grip tightened slightly, a silent affirmation. She had learned that survival was not just about hiding. It was about courage, planning, and trust. And she trusted John completely. As they worked to repair the fences and strengthen the ranch, their bond continued to grow. They shared more stories of their pasts, revealing fears, hopes, and dreams. John spoke of his wife Margaret, the life they had shared, and the loneliness that had followed her passing. Ayana shared memories of her childhood, the hardships she had endured, and the small moments of joy she had once known. Each story brought them closer, weaving a tapestry of understanding, empathy, and connection. One evening after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and pink. The world outside seemed distant, its judgment and threats fading in the warmth of their companionship. Ayana leaned her head against John's shoulder, feeling a sense of safety and belonging she had never experienced before. You saved me, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
John shook his head gently. No, Ayana.
We saved each other. You have courage I could never teach. You faced danger and fear, and you did not give up. I am proud of you. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting both gratitude and admiration. For the first time she felt that she truly belonged somewhere, that she had a place in the world where she was safe, valued, and respected. But life on the ranch was not without its hardships. The desert tested them constantly, with harsh winds, scorching sun, and the ever-present threat of drought. They had to work tirelessly to maintain the crops and ensure the cattle were fed and watered. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn, grow, and rely on one another. Ayana's skills improved steadily. She learned to ride the horse, tend the cattle, and manage the small garden that John had planted. Her confidence blossomed, and John watched with pride as she became more capable, independent, and self-assured. Yet despite her growing strength, she remained cautious. The world had been unkind to her, and she knew that safety was never guaranteed. John, too, was changing. He realized that the loneliness he had once felt was being replaced by companionship, trust, and a sense of purpose. Ayana had brought life and meaning back into his days, and he found himself looking forward to each sunrise, eager to face the day with her by his side. As the seasons shifted, the ranch became a symbol of their resilience. The animals thrived under their care, the crops grew steadily, and the cabin was filled with a quiet warmth that had been absent for many years. The desert, once a place of isolation and hardship, had become a home, a sanctuary where two people could live, work, and grow together. Yet John and Ayanna knew that their peace could be fragile. The world beyond the ranch still held dangers, and prejudice could surface at any moment. They remained vigilant, not out of fear alone, but out of a deep understanding that life required courage, planning, and unity. Through these challenges, their relationship deepened. They no longer relied solely on words to communicate. Gestures, glances, and small acts of care spoke volumes. Each day they learned more about one another, their strengths, their weaknesses, and their shared capacity for resilience. They were no longer simply a rancher and a young woman seeking refuge. They were partners, bound by experience, trust, and the understanding that together they could face whatever the desert or the world threw at them. In the quiet moments when the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert was bathed in twilight, John and Ayanna reflected on how far they had come. They had survived fear, danger, and judgment, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. The future remained uncertain, but they knew that they would face it together. And so, life on the ranch continued, filled with work, challenges, and growth. The desert remained harsh and unpredictable, but John and Ayanna had discovered the strength of their bond, the courage to protect, support, and trust one another. They had faced the consequences of their choices, endured the scrutiny of the outside world, and learned that true companionship was forged not in ease but in trials and shared resilience. Together, they were no longer just survivors. They were a family, a partnership, and a source of hope in a world that often seemed unforgiving. And in that understanding, they found peace, purpose, and the quiet joy of knowing that, no matter what came next, spring slowly gave way to summer, and the desert around John Mercer's ranch began to bloom in quiet, unexpected ways. The harsh dryness softened with occasional rains, washing the dusty earth and bringing small bursts of green to the once barren land. Life on the ranch had changed profoundly since Ayanna had arrived. What had begun as survival, a cautious routine of protection and work, had grown into something deeper: companionship, mutual trust, and a bond neither of them had expected. The events of the past months had left their marks on both of them. John no longer felt the heavy loneliness that had shadowed his days after losing Margaret. He had discovered in Ayanna a companion who could face fear with courage, who understood hardship, and who shared in the daily work of sustaining the ranch. Ayanna, in turn, had discovered safety, stability, and a life free from constant fear, something she had never known. Slowly, she had begun to open herself to the idea of a future that included hope, choice, and belonging. Though life had grown calmer, John and Ayanna continued to face challenges. The desert was always unpredictable, with sudden storms, dry spells, and wild animals that tested their vigilance. Their work on the ranch never truly stopped. The cattle needed feeding, the crops required care, and the fences needed constant maintenance. Yet, even in the midst of this demanding work, there was a sense of joy and purpose that filled their days. Each chore, no matter how small, was a shared effort, a reminder that they could rely on each other, not just for survival, but for life itself. Ayanna had grown remarkably in confidence and skill. She learned to ride the horse with ease, tend the cattle without hesitation, and manage the small vegetable garden John had planted near the cabin. Her hands, once bruised and weak from a life of running and hiding, were now strong and capable. John often watched her quietly from a distance, feeling pride swell in his chest. He had not anticipated how much joy it would bring him to see her thrive, to see her smile freely and work without fear. Their days were filled with simple pleasures, small victories that made the desert feel less harsh. Together they would gather eggs from the chicken coop, repair broken fences, and collect firewood for the coming nights. They celebrated minor successes: a healthy calf born to the herd, a bountiful harvest of vegetables, or a clear, star-filled sky after a storm. Each moment, no matter how ordinary, strengthened their bond and reminded them that life was worth living even in a place as challenging as the desert. Yet life in isolation also gave them time to reflect and grow emotionally. On quiet evenings, John and Ayanna would sit together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The desert glowed in shades of gold and crimson, and the wind whispered softly across the land. Sometimes they spoke of their pasts, John of his late wife Margaret and the loneliness that had followed, Ayanna of her childhood and the hardships she had endured. These conversations were gentle, careful, and often filled with silence, but each word, each shared memory, drew them closer together. One particular evening, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange, John spoke softly. "You've changed my life, Ayanna," he said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I thought the desert had taken everything from me, until you came." Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. "You saved me," she said, almost whispering, though her voice was steady. "Not just from them, but from myself, from fear. You showed me that life can be more than running and hiding." John shook his head gently. "We saved each other," he replied. "I could not have done this alone, and neither could you. Together, we found something stronger than fear." The air between them felt charged with a quiet understanding. For the first time, they did not speak of danger, survival, or the opinions of others. Instead, they simply existed in the shared knowledge that they had become family, partners in life, work, and heart. As the summer progressed, they began to imagine a longer-term future together. Ayanna took on more responsibilities around the ranch, and John encouraged her learning and independence. He taught her how to plan for the seasons, how to store food for winter, and even how to negotiate with merchants when they brought supplies. Ayanna's natural intelligence and sharp observation skills allowed her to learn quickly, and she soon began contributing ideas to improve the ranch, suggesting ways to rotate the crops and strengthen the fences. The townsfolk began to notice these changes as well. While some still whispered, others started to respect John and Ayanna. They saw the success of the ranch, the healthy cattle, and the neat, flourishing garden. Slowly, admiration replaced suspicion, and a few even offered help with supplies or advice. Though challenges remained, John and Ayanna felt a growing sense of acceptance. The world outside the ranch, once a source of fear and judgment, was beginning to recognize their hard work and determination. One afternoon, while tending the vegetable garden, Ayanna paused and looked at John. "Do you think we could make this place truly ours?" she asked. John smiled. "It already is, Ayanna. We've built it together. Every fence we repaired, every plant we nurtured, every animal we cared for. It's ours, and it will be as long as we keep working and looking after each other." Her face lit up with a small, hopeful smile. "I want that," she said. "I want to stay here, with you, and make this life ours." John's heart swelled. He had imagined companionship, but he had never dared hope for such a clear mutual choice, a decision born not out of necessity, but out of desire and trust. "Then that is what we will do," he said firmly. "Together." That evening, as the sun set, they walked together toward the hills behind the ranch. The desert stretched endlessly before them, the sky ablaze with colors, and the wind carrying a sense of peace. They sat side by side on a large rock, watching as the last light faded and the first stars appeared. In the quiet, they felt the weight of the past lift slightly, replaced by the promise of the future. Ayanna rested her head on John's shoulder. "I never thought I could be happy," she said softly. "I never thought anyone would care enough to protect me, or to stay with me." John wrapped an arm around her, holding her gently. "I know," he said, "but now we have each other." "That is enough. We faced fear, danger, and the world's judgment, and we've survived. That makes us strong, and it makes this life ours." They stayed there long after the sun had disappeared, watching the desert night unfold. The stars twinkled above them, endless and constant, a reminder that the world, though vast and sometimes harsh, could also be beautiful and full of hope. In that quiet they found contentment, a feeling of safety, trust, and belonging that neither had thought possible. Over the following months, the ranch flourished more than ever. Crops grew tall and healthy. The cattle thrived, and the cabin became a warm, welcoming home. Ayanna and John worked side by side, sharing responsibilities and planning for the future. Their relationship grew in depth, marked by shared experiences, trust, and a quiet understanding that had been forged through hardship. Ayana also began to interact more with the townsfolk, gaining their respect through her work and demeanor. Her quiet courage and intelligence slowly replaced suspicion with admiration. She began to see that the world could be kind, that not all people were cruel or indifferent, and John, who had once feared isolation, discovered that love and companionship could emerge even in the most unlikely places. One morning, as they prepared to take the cattle to the waterhole, John turned to Ayana. "You know," he said, smiling, "I never imagined my life would turn out like this. I thought the desert would always be lonely. But now, look at us." Ayana laughed softly, a sound that had grown more frequent over the months. "Yes," she said, "I never imagined I could feel safe or that I could want a home. But now, I do. I want this life, John. I want it with you." He nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest he had not felt in years. "Then we will have it," he said.
And we will protect it together, always.
The sun rose higher in the sky as they rode toward the waterhole, the desert stretching endlessly before them. It was no longer a place of fear, loneliness, or uncertainty. It had become a home, a sanctuary, and a place where two people, both scarred by life, both tested by hardship, had found each other. Together they faced the desert, not as a lonely rancher and a frightened young woman, but as partners, friends, and family. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, John and Ayana continued to build their life. The ranch grew stronger, their bond deeper, and their sense of purpose clearer. They laughed together, worked together, and shared quiet moments under the stars, knowing that the world beyond the desert could be unpredictable, but their companionship was constant. And so, under the endless sky and the blazing sun of the Arizona desert, John and Ayana lived a life they had never imagined possible. They had faced fear, danger, and judgment, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. Their journey had been difficult, but it had led them to a future filled with hope, safety, and the quiet joy of shared companionship. In the end, the desert was no longer a place of isolation. It was a place of life, love, and resilience. And together, John and Ayana had found something more precious than survival. They had found each other.